And I'm going to start recording once I'm ready to make you the co-host.
Okay.
Yep. Oh.
Good morning, everyone, to our NCAS Journal Club, and I am very pleased to introduce Associate Professor Deb Friedman, who's joining us through webcast from down in Geelong, and she's going to be talking about antimicrobial stewardship and mathematical models. Thanks very much, Deb.
Thanks, Kaz. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
And can you see the slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I decided to go a little bit outside my comfort zone and do something related to mathematical modelling, which I don't really understand that well. But this was based on a paper that was written and that was discussed by Yehuda Carmeli, who was one of the authors. So I decided that I'd talk about what it shows and how it's related to antimicrobial stewardship and antimicrobial resistance. So with regard to multi-resistant organisms, we know that antibiotic use in hospitals exerts a selective pressure which can accelerate the spread of resistant bacteria. And then humans can acquire multi-resistant bacteria in two different ways. One could be de novo emergence of a mechanism of resistance, but that's actually fairly unusual. But more commonly, it's by transmission of bacteria that are already resistant. And we know of some very successful bacterial clones like E. faecium, E. coli ST131, and some clonal K. pneumoniae groups that have been very successfully transmitted from patient to patient. A paper by Lipschitz in 2002 gives some really good explanations about how antimicrobial use leads to antimicrobial resistance on a population level. So I thought I'd go through this as a little bit of background to the topic. So in terms of mechanism of resistance, this is the basis of it. So for any infectious disease, the infectional colonisation status of an index patient affects the risk of infection or colonisation of others. Any other measures like vaccination or antibiotic treatment can alter the incidence and duration of infection in one person, but then they affect all of the contacts of that person. And the third sort of part of the theory is that if you eradicate susceptible organisms and therefore reduce the opportunity to transmit susceptible strains, then antibiotic therapy increases the opportunity that all other hosts, whether they're treated or untreated, will acquire resistant strains of bacteria. So this is highlighted in these figures. So if we look at this in this scheme, and you can see we're talking about treatment failure here. So in this case, you've got these subpopulations of resistant bacteria, which in a patient who otherwise has susceptible strains. So this, for example, might be like a cystic patient that has multiple different subpopulations of Pseudomonas. So when you treat the susceptible strains, there will still be some resistant strains, and that will lead to treatment failure. And treatment failure will then lead to overgrowth of these resistant strains that can then be transmitted to others. If you look at the case of successful treatment, if you've got a patient with a successful strain, which are these green circles on the left here, you treat them with antibiotics. It reduces their capacity to transmit this susceptible strain. However, it means that these hosts are more likely to become infected with resistant strains than they otherwise would have been. So the competitive balance between susceptible and resistant shifts, and you end up with transmission of resistant strains. So whether you talk about treatment failure or successful treatment, the end result can still be resistant strains. In the third scenario, which is referred to as eradication and replacement, in this case, you've got treatment of infection, which eradicates the susceptible bacteria. So you can see this yellow circle has no bacteria in it. With them being eradicated, the host is now, it's now possible for the host to acquire resistant strains. And so they require these red bacteria, which are the resistant strains. And that might occur, for example, if there was an outbreak and there was a circulating strain that was highly resistant. And so then the final scenario here that Lipschitz shows is treatment of a colonised individual. So you've got somebody that happens to be colonised with a multi-resistant bacteria, but you're treating them for another infection. So it results in an increased load of these multi-resistant bacteria, and then all of these susceptible hosts can become colonised or infected with resistant strains. So those are the sort of 4 proposed scenarios of how we acquire resistant organisms in the setting of antibiotic treatment. So in terms of the facilitation of MRO transmission, the next paper that I was going to talk about, which is a paper in which Yehuda Kamel is the lead author, they talk about the fact that in European studies, anywhere from 20 to 55% of patients that are admitted to hospital are treated with antibiotics. And I imagine it's probably fairly similar in Australia. And we know that antibiotics disrupt the commensal flora that protect against colonisation. So it increases vulnerability, which is exactly the same as what I've just shown you. But what they've given a numeric value to that and said that it's actually a 2 to 9-fold increased risk of acquisition of a multi-resistant organism. If you're colonised, you eradicate competing commensal organisms that are antibiotic sensitive, allowing overgrowth to those that are resistant. And then with an increasing load of multi-resistant organisms, you enhance the shedding and contagiousness of the MROs, and that increase is sort of 3 to 5-fold greater risk of MRO contamination in the environment. If you have a colonised patient not treated with antibiotics, they have about an 80% lower risk of room contamination than patients treated with antibiotics. So the paper that I wanted to refer to today talks about the impact of antibiotic use on transmission of resistant bacteria in hospitals. And in this, they look at both antimicrobial stewardship and also antimicrobial resistance. So it's referred to as an agent-based model to explore the impact of antibiotics on transmission and to then examine the potential of stewardship interventions to limit antibiotic-resistant bacterial spread in a hospital. So in the model that they used, they've basically got patients and they've got healthcare workers. Of an MRO occurs through contacts between patients and healthcare workers and between adjacent patients. So in the model that they used, antibiotic use affects the risk of transmission by increasing the vulnerability of susceptible patients and the contagiousness of colonised patients who are treated with antibiotics. So these are the parameters that they used in their simulations, and you could argue whether or not this is sort of something that would be similar to the Australian setting. So they've said that their average hospital's got 800 beds with 20 wards, 40 patients on each ward. The ratio of sort of nurse to patient is about 8 to 1, so 5 nurses per ward. Lots of hospital staff that move across wards, and that would include all different staff. They then assume a 50% compliance with standard infection control. So they're referring to mostly hand hygiene opportunities. And they're considering an average length of stay of 6 days among patients with susceptible organisms and about 12 days for patients who are colonised. And that's based on prior data that shows that if you're colonised with resistant bacteria, overall you end up with an increased average length of stay. So based on these parameters, that's how they did their mathematical modelling and their simulations. If you look at some of the baseline transmission probabilities, they've got a couple of strains that they're talking about. So you've got ARB, so anti-resistant bacteria L and anti-resistant bacteria H. And L is sort of low risk of transmission, H is high risk of transmission. So what they've assumed in this, and this is once again based on numerous sources of reference, that shows that these values are a reasonable ballpark. So they're saying if you've got an antibiotic-resistant bacteria of low contagiousness, if you have a contact between a healthcare worker and a colonised patient, then the transmission probability is about 5%. It's about double that if you've got an anti-resistant bacteria with high contagiousness. So here they look at the impact of antibiotic characteristics on the acquisition of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And they're looking at the transmission of two multi-resistant organisms, so those two that we talked about before, the sort of one that's less contagious and one that's more contagious. And based on the assumption that 40% of admitted patients receive antibiotics, and that 40% is based on European data, which I told you before, of between 20 and 55% of patients being treated with antibiotics. So you can see here, you've got conditions here where you've got C, which is contagiousness, and V, which is vulnerability. And if you are looking at conditions of no antibiotic pressure at all, then C would equal 1 and V would equal 1. So you'd be right down here in the lower left-hand corner of this graph on the left. So in the setting of very low antibiotic pressure, the antibiotic agent doesn't change contagiousness or vulnerability. And so the acquisition of this strain, this ARBL strain, is about 20 per 100,000 patient days. If that changes, when an antibiotic agent increases the vulnerability of contagiousness, so if you look at the other colours here, particularly the red one, you can see that you've got contagiousness at the highest level and vulnerability at a higher level. You can see an increased number of acquisitions. And then if you just go over to the graph on the right-hand side, what you can see is that with this highly resistant strain, everything is magnified so that there's a much higher risk of contagiousness. Sorry, I'm trying to see what Arjun's trying to say to me.
Oh, sorry, Deb. We had a comment that it wasn't working, but I think it should be working for other viewers. It might be a specific issue. So if you go back to slideshow, that should be fine. Sorry.
Okay. Should I continue?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's working for everyone else.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry.
So just looking at the next slide, this looks at the increase in acquisition of antibiotic-resistant bacteria relative to no antibiotic use as antibiotic density increases. So this is where you're in an environment where there's a lot of antimicrobial use. So this might be, for example, in an intensive care unit. The increase in the number of antibiotic density increases the incidence of transmission of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So it's just the density in the environment per se which increases acquisition of resistant bacteria. Then just looking at individual risk for antibiotic-resistant bacteria acquisition, here you've got in the black bars, you've got patients treated with antibiotics, and the grey bars are patients not treated with antibiotics. And what we can see here in these different simulations, you can see that an antibiotic that doubles both vulnerability and contagiousness, so where C equals 2 and V equals 2, this is where we would refer to this as an early stage of antimicrobial resistance spread. And you can see here in the different simulations between patients, we've got 1% of patients colonised in this environment, but with a highly transmissible ARB, you can see how the increase in incidence goes. If you've got 10% of individuals colonised, interestingly, there's already a lot of patients treated with antimicrobials, so you can see the bars here. But there's a very high incidence already of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So the summary of their results is that increasing the proportion of patients receiving antibiotics increases the rate of acquisition, but it's in a non-linear fashion. The effect of antibiotics on the spread of resistance depends on the characteristics of the antibiotic agent and on the density of antibiotic use. An antibiotic's impact on the spread increases when the bacterial strain is more transmissible, and it decreases as resistance prevalence rises. The individual risk for acquiring a multi-resistant bacteria increases in parallel with antibiotic density, and this is both for patients treated and non-treated with antibiotics. So the take-home message here is that, for example, if you're a patient in an intensive care unit, even if you're not treated with an antibiotic, you're in a very antibiotic dense environment, so that your individual risk of acquisition increases. So in these simulations, they then looked at possible antimicrobial stewardship interventions. The simulations that they performed here was where they decreased the number of patients treated with antibiotics. So these were the three sort of interventions that you could do. Number one, reduce the number of people treated with antibiotics. Number two, shorten the duration of antibiotic courses. And number three, replace antibiotic agents with high impact values, so the high vulnerability and contagiousness, with ones of low impact. Now, having said that, there's not a lot of precise data about which antibiotics have low V and low C. So I can't exactly tell you which antimicrobials they're referring to here. These are assumptions, but we actually don't know among the antibiotics we have about precise values of vulnerability and contagiousness. So if you look here, this highlights the effects of various antimicrobial stewardship interventions on the daily number of acquisitions of a highly resistant antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So if you look down here, A, all of the bottom bars, which are A, refer to this high impact antibiotic where V and C equal 4. And at the top where you've got B, so these top two bars, you've got an antibiotic which is much lower in impact where C equals 2 and V equals 2. And you can see here, if you look down here at type A, so a higher impact antibiotic, where you've got a 7-day period, you may well have either, so colonisation on admission could be 1%, which is the green bar, or 10%, which is the blue bar. But you can see that if you reduce the duration of therapy, that you get a reduction in colonisation through reduction in the duration of antimicrobial treatment. They also performed a sensitivity analysis to look at compliance with infection prevention guidelines like hand hygiene, and they looked at patient numbers, so nurse to patient ratios. The variables that they used in this analysis were the nurse's compliance with infection control measures and the number of patients per ward. The nurse's compliance, they found, had the strongest impact on the rate of acquisition of a multi-resistant bacteria. So that if you reduced compliance from 50% to 40%, this more than tripled acquisitions. And if you increased compliance just by 10% from 50%, it reduced acquisitions by more than half. If you reduce the number of patients in a ward, so instead of having 40 patients in a ward, if you only had 8 patients on a ward, this reduced the acquisition of a highly antimicrobial resistant bacteria by about 15 to 20%. But what they found, interestingly, that the nurse to patient ratio didn't really significantly impact the acquisition rate. And the relative impact of increased antibiotic density on acquisition remained pretty similar. So the major changes here were compliance with infection control measures and the number of patients per ward. So the conclusions from this is that antibiotic treatment in the hospital setting plays an important role in determining the spread of resistance. And if you've got interventions to limit antibiotic use, you have the potential to reduce the spread of resistance. But this is going to be predominantly by choosing an agent that has a favourable profile. And that was what we were talking about before, the V and the C, the vulnerability and contagiousness. Reductions in antibiotic use are going to have the greatest impact on multi-resistant organism transmission in places where you've got high antibiotic density, especially when MRO colonisation rates are low, because when MRO colonisation rates are high, you've got less of an impact. But we do need to have methods to measure the impacts of antibiotics so that they can be incorporated into drug development programs, and so that we actually will know the V and C values for various antimicrobials. The risk of antimicrobial resistant bacteria acquisition for a patient treated with an antibiotic is quite substantial in a high antibiotic density environment. And we know from previous studies that colonisation will then progress to clinical infection in about 8 to 30% of patients who are colonised by an antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So, thanks for your attention. Sorry if there was problems with the connection and the webinar. And I'm just finishing off. This is a photo from the Ai Weiwei exhibition on Cockatoo Island in Sydney at Easter time, showing refugees in an enormous, probably triple life-sized raft. Thank you.
Any questions?
Deb, it's Taz.
Yes.
So just, I guess the unanswered question now is which antibiotics and how, were there any suggestions from the authors how they will, the next steps in determining that the classes or antibiotics that they have been modelling? Was there any sort of did they allude to any particular classes?
No, and I was hoping that they would have. I was sort of expecting that you could see the sort of usual players and that they might allude to something such as clindamycin, but that didn't. So that was not something that they included in the paper, and they say that it's really not known.
Are there any questions online?
Okay.
No. Thanks, Deb. It's really interesting, and it would be great to have sort of a commentary on that simplifies it for our stewardship community, pulling all those papers together. I think it would be really worthwhile.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now, Arjun.
Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Arjun. This was a talk that I gave, I think it was last week. Was it last week or the week before? At the ANZIC's Quality and Safety Conference, and it was a session that was bookended by myself and Simon Finfer from the Sepsis Alliance. Also had a speaker from the Clinical Excellence Commission, Malcolm Green, and it really was all about focusing on implementation of sepsis and the limitations of some of the tools that we have. So the Think Sepsis Act Fast collaboration really follows on from a long journey that started in 2012. I won't go through the whole Peter Mac implementation, but suffice to say that the implementation of the whole of hospital sepsis pathway at Royal Melbourne Hospital, the results of that led to its selection as one of the implementations to be scaled up in hospitals that submitted expressions of interest, and this is what we're undertaking at the moment. The aim of the program really is to put in place a strong clinical pathway that supports a whole of hospital approach to the recognition, resuscitation and referral of patients, to retain the use of early warning criteria, as well as to define severe sepsis criteria, to engage nurses as key players in the management of sepsis, and also to support the ownership of patient care, which has been very well demonstrated in both the Peter Mac and Royal Melbourne pathways, and to engage key players across emergency wards and the ICU. And I think at the end of the day, we do need to recognise that the majority of our patients with sepsis do present through ED. The pathway, of course, was designed to support good handover, particularly for patients transitioning out of the emergency department. And underpinning all of it is trying to ensure that there's good antimicrobial stewardship, to ensure that there are local empiric guidelines which support appropriate antimicrobial use, and to prompt action. This pathway, of course, is really addressing the first 6 hours or first 24 hours, and there's plenty to say about following patients de-escalating at 24 to 48 hours. I'm not going to cover that today, but I think it is something that we need to, as stewards, focus on how to ensure that we transition sepsis pathway patients to early de-escalation or switch. But I'm going to focus today on really how we're implementing the program. So the entire paper, which covers the period from 2012 through to 2017, was published just recently in the BMJ Open Quality. It is open access, so you can have access to all the pathway documents, the results of the implementation, and very detailed description of the processes and gap analyses that were undertaken at the Peter Mac to drive the implementation process. And it really gives a very nice story as to why we came to the decision that this had to be a clinical pathway that was supported by nurse initiation, that was a medical record document to improve documentation and clinical coding for sepsis. And I welcome all of you to have a look at it. And this morning, the CIDRAP group have released the podcast that I did this week around that paper. The other piece of the puzzle is when we're doing implementations in stewardship, there is a real need to ensure that we are undertaking cost effectiveness and health economic studies, because of course this underpins whether or not these programs are going to be funded in our current healthcare system. Michelle Chews is one of our NCIC PhD fellows, and this is a proportion of the work she's done around this pathway at Peter Mac, which demonstrated in the short term that there is very significant both cost and mortality benefit of the pathway. She's also undertaken a much more complex health economic analysis, which will be published soon, which really looks at the long-term costs of sepsis, which is the other important piece. And she's taken into account there the mortality associated with cancers and the impact. So health economic evaluation, you can certainly do short-term, but also long-term costs, which are not traditionally done, but also very important. This is one of the figures from the paper, which really I wanted to focus the impact on particularly some of the target antibiotics that we have been trying to get on top of prior to the implementation of the pathway. If you have a clinical pathway that deprioritises vancomycin and carbapenems to the empiric treatment, then you will see a continued and sustained reduction in those broad spectrum antibiotics. In our first version of the pathway, it was a relatively simple pathway which really focused on piperacillin tazobactam or kefapine for initial therapy of sepsis in our hospital. keeping in mind that half of our patients, just under half of our patients were neutropenic fever, another 30% were complex colorectal patients, and we felt that this was an appropriate initial antibiotic for the sepsis pathway, but recognised that once we saw that the PIP-TAS use was rising, in subsequent versions we moved to a more disease-based empiric guideline, which has been adopted at the Royal Melbourne with the Sepsis Act Fast initiative. I also wanted to point out the NORSP data, which Peter McNair contributes to, and we have gone back to that period, demonstrate that our overall total DVD usage of antibiotics as well as PIP-TAS and carbapenems is lower than general hospitals, and that's despite the fact that we have very high acuity patients. So this is a picture of the sepsis pathway that's in place at Royal Melbourne, which is a fold-out document. This in the middle shows you the actions to be undertaken, and then further opening up opens up the empiric guidelines. This is very much liked by junior medical staff and nursing staff because it really brings in that discussion at the point of care about the appropriate antibiotic therapies. There's been much discussion, debate around the use of sepsis criteria, and it was interesting to hear at ANZICS their own analysis of the sepsis criteria has really led to the realisation that the QSOFA is not feasible or practical anymore, and that there does need to be a recognition that hypotension and lactate are included as severe sepsis. So I'm very pleased that the approach that we took through a consensus has proven to remain an effective and sustainable approach. So the Peter Mac initial pathway, we pretty much used the old criteria and included hypertension. Through a consensus approach with ED and ICU clinicians, general physicians, we talked long and hard about the appropriate criteria, and this has been accepted as the criteria being used for the statewide scale-up. I'm not going to go through the pathway in detail, to suffice to say that these key actions are in line with international sepsis guidelines, such as the UK Sepsis Trust, the Sepsis 6, I suppose, the Surviving Sepsis Campaign, which is more detailed, and then, of course, the Clinical Excellence Mission Sepsis Kills program, which really sort of drove some of the original adoption of how we developed our pathway. The items in red, the blood cultures, lactate and IV antibiotics within 60 minutes, are the three process measures that have been recorded as part of the Think Sepsis Act Fast collaboration. Part of that is feasibility. Measuring quality of oxygen administration and IV fluids are almost impossible. The collaboration will be looking at not only the process measures, but also costing and patient outcome measures and resource utilisation during the implementation process. I wanted to focus a little bit more on the complexity of implementing and the approach to fluids. Again, this is another, I guess, contentious area in the ICU world where there is an argument around too much fluid and delayed offloading, potentially being associated with increased mortality, and how much is safe in terms of in-hospital administration out of ICU, and also the total volume. So I remind you that, for example, the Surviving Sepsis Campaign volume is 30 mils per kilo of crystalline. In my exposure to intensivists at international conferences and in Australia, very few I see give those sorts of volumes. And a pragmatic approach taken by New South Wales and with us, recognising that whenever we've audited fluid, the average volume has always been 500 mils, is that the volume is 500 mils crystalloid with a bolus. And outside of ED, this would be the average volume that was given. The impact of the Royal Melbourne pathway, compared to baseline performance, and I acknowledge all the complexities with identifying patients. Coding for sepsis is not perfect, but as a quality program, there was clearly a significant impact on sepsis admissions to ICU, length of stay, time to antibiotic therapy, and a switch in pattern of antimicrobial usage and uptake of the pathway. And these were the sort of core results that we demonstrated. And in actual fact, they're almost the same as the impact that we had with the Peter-Mac pathway, which has remained sustained. Thinking about the impact on recognition and timeliness, one of the things that we observed at Royal Melbourne was that there was a greater recognition of sepsis in the ED at presentation, and a reduction in sepsis recognised on the wards through routine observations or unit wards and even MET calls. And this is really the expected shift with appropriate recognition through ED, and a reduction in missed sepsis patients being admitted up into the ward. You can also see that the impact of and time to antibiotics is very much impacted by the triage criteria. So of course, CAT 1 is straight through to the cubicle, CAT 2 is 10 minutes, CAT 3 is 30 minutes clinical review, and so on. And we were able to significantly improve that once the pathway was implemented. These were patients that were not managed up the pathway. This poses its own problems with implementing a sepsis pathway. So some of our regional partners that have already very busy emergency departments, they're finding real issues in terms of what to do with these patients that meet criteria when there's a bare block and no space. At the Royal Melbourne, this did happen, but it led to some additional actions through the executive to improve bed movements through ED, and also to open up a new area. So in actual fact, it helped to drive some changes to improve patient flow. So the collaboration's objectives are primarily to look at adherence to the clinical pathway, to reduce sepsis-related mortality, reduce median length of stay, and sepsis-related ICU admissions, in addition to improving time to antibiotics, and improving appropriateness and engaging the consumers. This is a core element of the whole collaboration, which has been really incredible to see. These are the participating health services in Victoria, so Albury-Wodonga Health, Alfred, Ballarat, Barwon, Bendigo Eastern, Southwest, Swan Hill, Gippsland, Western and Peninsula, and I can show you some update reports from a couple of those. The collaboration is moving very quickly, and the hospitals are on a really very tight timeline, and it has been interesting to see them having to come together very quickly with their sepsis working parties to ensure that the pathway has been adequately reviewed, that the ID stewardship groups are happy with their empiric guidelines, and there is substantial variation across the different hospitals with what they chose to go forward with, and it was an interesting process. We have run workshops along the way which have been particularly focusing on ensuring that barriers are addressed. So the first workshop really was a kickstart to set the scene of what they're expected to do. The workshop we had a couple of weeks ago was all about consumers, and there were consumers from all the groups present, and they were really trying to work together to ensure that the communications and the patient experience was maximised through this collaboration. And so this is the timeline through to February, March next year. The outstanding question, of course, is how to ensure that these programs are sustainable, and that will be the subject of our next workshop, because it's really quite important to think about how these programs are funded in our healthcare system. There's a mismatch between performance based funding versus funding for quality safety programs, where you do actually need EFT on site to support the sustainability of them. We, through the Royal Melbourne work, we obviously supplied a very detailed planning and toolkit. The part of the reason that it has been sort of quite quick off the mark to get going is that the funding supported a full-time project officer and had a session for an ID or other physician to support the implementation. And that's actually been very important because it's allowed them to really focus and move the program along. The governance and committee engagement, of course, and unit level engagement are all essential parts of a whole of hospital implementation, and teach them how to process, map current practices, undertaking the gap analysis are all important parts of the puzzle as well. This is an example of that's Western Health Pathway, where there was some modifications according to local preference. And of course, this is Barwon Health Sepsis Pathway, where they have adapted and modified the empiric guidelines according to their own. This ability to modify according to their own practice and stewardship programs, I think, is really important for local ownership and uptake of the program. We have been quite hands-on, particularly Kelly, who has been amazing. So the project is being Better Care Victoria project staff, and Kelly has essentially been attending and visiting each of the sites, including sitting through their steering committees, troubleshooting and project managing. The workshops have been very important because they've been held at other sites, not just at Royal Melbourne, so it has created that sense of ownership again. There's been lots of sharing and collaboration of tools, lanyards, posters. It's been really, I'll show you some fantastic photos in a minute. As well as implementing some of the core elements of what was successful in our implementation, which was to, as a pathway is being piloted and implemented, that the project team individualise the feedback to both medical and nursing staff about how the sepsis was managed in that particular patient, and if there are any particular gaps. That sort of close feedback loop in a timely way is really important in that initial kick-off process. Because of the complexities of EMR implementation, it's mostly Cerner at the other sites. There's been a split-off group directly addressing the way that the sepsis pathway will be managed through the EMR sites. And this is still under a lot of discussion. The Clinical Excellence Commission have produced an excellent paper which is available, where they compared the paper pathway to an EMR-driven prompt. It's an adaptation of the St John's algorithm, which is a little complex but does have some elements of SIRS and some elements of severe sepsis, which showed that both the paper pathway and the St John's were equivalent in terms of recognition of sepsis. Nevertheless, it is a new area of complexity to ensure that we don't over-trigger sepsis through the EMR, because obviously with automated triggers, you will know a lot more. You will be picking up a lot more patients. So there is a dedicated working group to try and look at the implementation impact of these systems. We are using a program called Basecamp to communicate, and it's been fantastic. It's a cloud-based program where there's a sort of a chat group or campfire where case studies or questions, materials are shared amongst the project teams, and where all documents are available. So it's been a very open, sharing and transparent collaboration across all the sites. It's been really amazing to see. This is, I don't know why sepsis seems to be associated with baking, but it's been really interesting to see the branding and the launches at each of the participating sites, and I know that many of these sites, some of them have even done sepsis songs. So one of the, I think it's Swan Hill had their sepsis song, this I'm too, it's based on the I'm Too Sexy song. It's hilarious. So it's just terrific. I think it's amazing. So we're midway now, and we are starting to see many of the sites starting to actively pilot now. We will have a second period. They've all completed their baseline data collection. There will be a similar period in the second period of data collection to match their baseline data collection, so that's seasonally matched. There is the Department of Health have a group called Alpha Crucis who will be doing the data analysis and the economic analysis of the program. Not a full economic analysis, but certainly looking at the resource utilisation of the program. This is a newsletter that Kelly put out. There's Kelly, which we showed at the workshop. And I guess some of the scale of it is amazing to me, and particularly that's actually probably an underestimate of the number of clinicians that have had education, that patients on the pathway, that we are starting to engage more formally with New South Wales Clinical Ethics Commission to share our experience with the whole of hospital approach. The Emergency Clinical Care Network, which is a parallel but combined process, is also implementing some ED-based, and they are utilising our toolkit and implementation resources as well, which is really good. So a different group but supporting our process. There's been great impact already in terms of some of the process measures, which is fantastic to see. These are some updates that we did at our workshop, just to show you the focus that the focus is really about implementation and implementation barriers. And this is Albury Wodonga, which are working on their consumer engagement, that they've started the pilot. This is their focus. World Sepsis Day is coming up on September the 13th. These are some of the challenges. It's interesting, there are some very small sites where the actual number of sepsis patients, coded sepsis patients, have been very small. So it's interesting. It will be interesting to see the impact of those. The data will be able to capture the impact of the pathway on patient transfer from small sites into central sites, and the outcome of those patients in terms of earlier transfer. So there'll be some very interesting findings. And as I've always said to everyone, there is a multi-collaboration ethics approval now, and the opportunities for additional research around the program are enormous. This is the Alfred, where they've piloted and started in the haematology and gen med wards just in the last couple of weeks. They have their own challenges with EMR and developing power plans for Cerner. Again, looking at how to full-scale implementation, sustainability, missed opportunities, scope of practice. This scope of practice for nursing in terms of cannulation and doing bloods and blood cultures and things, I think is really important part of the project. So the current challenges I see really are, we are dealing with a healthcare system in Victoria, which is a bit hodgepodge in terms of progression from the non-EMR to EMR, and EMR in progress when they're expected to put in a sepsis pathway in a fairly short time period. So it has had its own challenges. We at the Royal Melbourne have had great success with modifying the symphony trigger in the ED to support the early warning and the severe sepsis criteria, and that's working very well. Again, each ED is very different in terms of how their systems are set up, and some of them are transitioning again. So I guess at the end of the day, I wanted to focus really on what it actually means, and these are some of the testimonials that we have had both at Royal Melbourne and at the other sites where, sepsis is becoming part of our culture. As a nurse, I'm much more aware. It wasn't something we really recognised before. Everyone knows the pathway. It doesn't take convincing to use it. The communication, I guess, is key here because it's empowering. It gives the nursing staff in particular a voice, and I hope junior medical staff as well, the ability to escalate, advocate, the resources, and in hospitals, particularly regional hospitals where you have medical staff rotating in and out on rotations, it's sort of Groundhog Day every time the new cohort come. And really for those sites, it's been enormously beneficial to have a standardised clinical pathway the nurses who are the coordinators of care, who are the front line, who are consistently in those areas, can actually present it in front of them. So it really has significantly improved communication with those visiting medical staff. This was a consumer, a parent of a child that came through RMH, not a child, I should say, 18-year-old, but her son came through RMH, and she really felt as though she could see that the staff were following the sepsis pathway. She saw it as a call to action, coordinated response. And this is really something our consumers on the project really have not shied away from, the fact that they want to know what sepsis is. They think it's important not to say severe infection. They want to hear the word sepsis. That's the feedback. And they really want to know what are their expectations of their hospital in terms of how they're going to manage it. Not to shy away from dumbing down the situation, because they don't realise how serious sepsis is. So that's feedback from our consumers. So I'll leave it from there. Open for questions.
You talked about sustainability and education, staff turnover, and then you talked about touched on trainer.
Yes, yes.
So how's that? You've got gold standard trainers that are training staff.
We haven't formalised that, but I guess my comment is that in general, nursing staff in hospitals have a pretty good education structure. They have the clinical nurse educators, they're quite good. They seem to have a real structure around in-services, and so it's not been hard ever to put sepsis into that. We have got a standardised e-learning package now, which is going out to all sites. Some of them are making that mandatory if they can, others aren't. The doctors are the tricky ones, so it's not difficult to sort of embed it as part of orientation for junior staff. It's the challenge really is how to get to the decision makers, which are the rotating registrars and senior medical staff. I mean, we find that with stewardship too. So that is why we've sort of pushed more towards trying to make it a sort of a mandatory learning experience. In terms of the on-the-ground management of sepsis, then that's an issue, because we, in our own experience at Royal Melbourne, there's a whole lot more patients that need review. The stewardship program can't manage the burden of patients who need to be reviewed and de-escalated, and yet we haven't quite transitioned to the ownership by the home teams about doing that promptly and effectively. So that's a piece of work that needs to be done. I think that the role of advanced nurses, I have an advanced nursing practitioner who reviews sepsis patients, does stewardship rounds, allergy delabelling and low risk pathways. Her role has proven extremely effective. So I think developing the workforce to support sepsis projects, I think if we think about other quality initiatives in hospitals like hand hygiene and other areas, they usually have associated EFT to help audit and monitor and feedback. So our position in terms of sustainability is that these projects do need ongoing support funding for resources, and that has been my recommendation to Better Care Victoria.
And I think you picked up on the Twitter a while back that there's been some debate about bacteriostatic versus bactericidal antibiotics that makes a difference for these particular severe patients. Yes. Are you looking at the antibiotic choice here? Because most of the antibiotics you mentioned are bactericidal.
Yes, no, I think. Oh, sorry. Glenn was talking about bacteriostatic and bactericidal. My reading of the literature was that was really related to focusing on PKPD and effective dosing rather than whether they're static or cidal. So of course here we clearly maximise dosing, particularly the beta-lactam. So for example, if you pick TAS 6 hourly. Most of our, in terms of initial therapy for unknown sepsis, opposed to directed, for presumed communicable pneumonia, where most hospitals are using, of course, Keptrax and Azithro for severe, Ben-Pen. There has been an interesting variation in these patients. So, for example, Albury-Wodonga use a lot of IV amoxiclav, which is really, they must have funding for it because none of us would use that. Other hospitals really debated around the use of even dual cephalosporins for allergy. You know, there was much discussion, interesting discussion about how individual sites were approaching it. But at the end of the day, I think it is maximum. If it's severe sepsis, then you need to be maximising dosing. So there are sort of core principles in that empiric guideline. Of course, there's the therapeutic guideline. So some sites have used the sepsis recommendations for therapeutic guideline as well. So it's interesting, the variation now. Any other questions? Any online? No? Okay, well, we might...
questions, so they're just asking us to repeat the questions.
Oh, sorry about that. All right, well, we might close off a few minutes early, and thanks everyone. I think we had almost three times of people online than in the room this morning, so thank you for joining, everyone. That was good.